Hi, everyone. This is Mike Wilkerson. I am the founder of Stormwall Advisors, the host of Stormwall.com, and the author of Why America Matters. Coming to you on the first Tuesday after Labor Day, September 5th, 2023. This is the Stormwall Advisors monthly update for the month of September. And today we're going to be covering off on a bit of a different subject. We spent a lot of time on this series, at least, talking about inflation, about the economy, about the markets, where we're going. Is there going to be a recession? Is there not? All of these things. I want to shift the focus today and talk about the shifting geopolitical landscape. And in particular, I want to talk about some of the very interesting events that we've seen happening over the last month or two. Three things, really. I want to talk about BRICS Plus, which the summit was just held in Johannesburg a few weeks ago for 2023. Some interesting developments there we'll get into. I want to talk about this very interesting string of coup d'etats that have occurred in Africa, in particular in Francophone West Africa. Is it a coincidence, or is there something behind it? Is there something else going on? And as we talk about BRICS, I just want to touch very, very briefly on de-dollarization. So we're going to have a bit of a geopolitical focus today. Check out Stormwall Advisors at stormwalladvisors.com, where you can learn more. Don't forget, if you enjoy this video, to like it, share it, subscribe it. Check me out on my YouTube channel. Also, you can sign up for all of my articles, videos, everything that we're doing, Stormwall Advisors or related to Stormwall Media, at stormwall.com. So why don't we jump into this? I'm going to share my screen here if technology will allow it. Let's see if we got it. I think we do. All right. So let's go into it. Shifting geopolitical landscape. I want to talk about BRICS Plus and the end of La France-Afrique. So a couple things for today. I've mentioned that something very strange. We've had 7 successful coup d'etats in Africa in 3 years. Now, 6 of these have been in the French sphere of influence, which I find very interesting. We also saw just a couple weeks ago, in the same month of October, the assassination of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, the Russian private military company's the person most responsible for Russia's influence in Africa. And I'd like to ask the question, who done it? It's not clear on the surface, and we'll get into that a little bit. And then BRICS Nation Summit, as we talked about, what does it mean for the U.S.? And then facts around de-dollarization. So 7 African coup d'etats really in the last 3 years, since 2020. We've had Gabon, Niger, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Guinea, Chad, and Mali. A couple of these had redos where a temporary government was established. It didn't work. They moved on it again. What's fascinating to me is this really describes the centerpiece of the former French colonies, and where France still has a very significant influence. So something here is going on. Now, there's common motivations among all these things, frustrations that are expressed in each of these countries, each of these situations, fraudulent elections, a kleptocracy where there's widespread corruption and looting by political leaders, unstable institutions where the rule of law isn't in effect, poverty, injustice that continues in many of these countries, nepotism by the same leaders passing things on to their family members, and then a sense that business and politics are not self-determined, not controlled within the nation, but controlled by foreign, in these cases, either French or U.S. interests, or political or business. Now, at the same time, even though these are rebellions against France, these are countries that are very much French. They're culturally French. French is the official language. All of the putschists' speeches were given in French. Culturally, very, very tight. And economies are also very linked, with France the largest trading partner in most of these countries, and they all share a common currency. Now, what hasn't been as focused on is that each of these countries have been, in recent years, heavily influenced by Russia's African pivot. So we talked about at the introduction, the assassination of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Here he is days before his assassination on a video where he was in Africa. Now, the Wagner Group and other Russian PMCs have been active in Africa since at least 2017, especially in this region in West Africa and in Central Africa, also in places like Mozambique and elsewhere. But they have been active in many ways, carrying out the military and commercial interests of Russia on the continent in this region. It's interesting to note that now Russia has established military cooperation agreements with over 40 African countries, and that's up from 19 back in 2017. So part of this is about trade. It's about a $25 billion mutual trade in 2023 estimated. That's up 35% from last year. Africa is a big export market for Russian grains, fertilizers, other commodities, agricultural commodities, but also for arms. So approximately 50% of Africa's arms imports come from Russia. Now, the Russian commercial focus has been largely on mining and resource extraction, like gold and industrial metals. But again, as we started to talk about, Russia has specifically targeted La France-Afrique, the French-controlled region around the Sahel, the area bordering the Sahara Desert. This is clearly the least stable region, weak government, easy targets. The U.S. officially said that they believe that Russia was behind the Chadian rebellion, and they also in Central African Republic. And it's pretty clear that it is likely that Russia has been the likely sponsor and the facilitator, either directly or through these PMCs, of these recent coups in France's sphere of influence. Now, this all sort of comes to a head right in the middle. Let's go back and just note that in July and August, there were two recent coups. So one in Gabon in August, one in Niger. This one is still going on, hotly contested. We'll come on and talk about that in a second. But at the same time, when Prigozhin, you'll recall a few months ago, he did his infamous march on Moscow to protest the way the Ukraine war was being conducted. This was portrayed in the West as an insurrection. It was less than that. It was a protest march. He backed off intentionally after his group made some noise and made a point. But nonetheless, this caught the attention of everyone as to what was his relationship with Putin, which had historically been very, very strong, and whether he was likely to last very long under the assumption that this was an insurrection, this was a rebellion. Although I think if you listen to those who pay attention more closely to what's going on, it's not so clear that that's what it was, as opposed to a boisterous and terrible mistake on Prigozhin's part. So a few weeks ago, Prigozhin was reportedly in a plane with his number two and the head of finance and logistics for the Wagner Group. The plane was brought down apparently by a bomb in luggage or in some compartment on board, and presumably he was killed. Now there is some question out there, and you see this article about whether he actually was killed or whether this was just another very complicated masquerade or disguise on the part of Prigozhin and or Putin and or the government generally around the fate of the head of the Wagner Group. But that it seems to me it is likely, if not a certainty, but at least likely that he was killed. So the question is, who killed him? Who done it? The Western governments and the media have quickly concluded, well, of course, Putin did it. It was obvious that he was going to be taken out after what he did, the insurrection, etc. Something very interesting, though, which is that Putin came on air after his death and basically gave a peroration, basically gave a praise of Prigozhin, the role that he had played on behalf of Russia. He said, yes, he was a successful businessman who made mistakes in his life, but then went on to describe the role that he played on behalf of Russia, and really described him as a patriot. Although interestingly, Prigozhin did not receive military honors for his funeral. His number two did, and Putin did not attend. So ostensible answer is that Putin did it, but it's interesting to think, and you look at who else had motive and means. Number one, the French government. So we've talked about the Wagner group has been the stabilizing force in France Afrique. They have been the number one cause of the destabilization of actions within Africa, in French Africa. The Ukraine government, obviously, number two. He has been a terminable enemy to the Ukrainian forces. Some would argue his forces have been more successful than Russian regular troops. And he certainly had many enemies within the Russian oligarchy and within the Russian Department of Defense, whom he had often challenged. So who did it? We may never know, but I think one thing is for sure, that in Russia, as perhaps in our own country, in the US, things are never as they appear. Now, I want to focus on one of the most recent coups, which is in Niger. This one is clearly an anti-France movement. This sign here means basically down with France and long live Putin. So pro-Russia, you don't really see them here, but in other videos and photos, you see Russian flags being flown, etc. This was clearly anti-military, anti-French in orientation. The Nigerians have asked for France to leave. France has declined. They have kept their ambassador there. France's President Macron has signaled military intervention through ECOWAS proxies. This is the economic community of West African states, and basically seeking intervention. The U.S., interestingly, says they won't intervene. They have not acknowledged this as a successful coup, because that would trigger certain requirements on the part of the U.S. to act. But what is very, very clear in Niger is that Russian influence has been very high through information warfare. The military junta and popular media and otherwise have been very pro-Russian in sentiment. There is a military agreement there, question of the presence of Russian military advisors or not. But this signals what is happening in the region and the destabilization that is going on. Now, all of this begs the question, and this is an important one, whether Senegal is next. Senegal is arguably the most important, the crown jewel of French Africa. It's a modest success story within the region. They had a pretty decent democracy running for a while until last year, when they sort of abruptly turned away when things weren't going well for the ruling party and leader. And there have been very strong mass popular protests since March of this year, anti-French, anti-establishment. The opposition leader, Sonko, was charged with plotting an insurrection, charged with rape and other things. You know, they always tag on these sort of other charges as well. And then almost immediately, the very internationally famous French lawyer and activist Juan Branco was arrested for representing Sonko. Now, eventually, Branco was released. He put out a scathing rebuttal in the media, and it's out there on YouTube. You can see it. But the point is that this now feels like Senegal is at elevated risk. Maybe things are fine. Maybe they stabilize, but they have dissolved the opposition party. They've shut down the internet largely in anticipation of a election that they propose for next year. So I think this is very unstable and just adding to regional stability. Now, I think it's important to note that the U.S. is being completely outmaneuvered in Africa. China and Russia, China certainly for 20 years have been extremely active and focused on China. When I was running an investment firm that was focused on Africa, we came across Chinese interests that were backed by the state all the time. Russia was a bit of a new entry. I began to hear and see Russian presence beginning around 2017, the same years that they began to be involved in West and Central Africa. They were also present in South Africa, pushing nuclear power in that context. Africa has never been a large priority for the U.S. Where we have been interested in Africa has been around Cold War issues of destabilizing emerging democracies where it wasn't clear that they were going to lean towards the US hard line, if they were either neutral or potentially leaning pro-Soviet. The CIA was extremely active in the 50s, 60s, and beyond in destabilizing a number of these countries through facilitating coup d'etats, through even, in some cases, assassinations. So the U.S. is really, beyond that and security and military interest, the U.S. has had lots of talk about its interest and commitment to Africa. Humanitarian efforts are really a conduit for laundering money to some of these most corrupt kleptocratic leaders. And so the nonprofit sector has really corrupted, first of all, entrepreneurship in Africa, but also leaders who can skim off quite a bit of this. Any real investment on the continent that is focused on jobs, on infrastructure, on the kind of basic building blocks of the economy, the U.S. is not focused on it, leaving it largely to, at least for the West, the colonial interests, France and Great Britain. Whereas China certainly took a very pragmatic interest and made loans, made investment, infrastructure, power stations, bridges, roads, etc. And this is now coming back to haunt and to bite the United States. So acting U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, the largely architect of the Ukraine debacle and situation there, a hardcore neocon, just showed up in South Africa and in Niger and elsewhere. Largely, it was described by the South African media as being unprepared and desperate, no real responsibility to address what was happening with these coups in Niger and elsewise. The Nigerian junta leaders were snubbed her basically during her trip to the continent and did not want to engage. Now, one of the reasons why the U.S. is failing here is because the U.S. is focused on all the wrong things. I mentioned some of the mistakes that have been made in donations that go to the wrong places, that don't encourage work, that really create more problems than they solve. But the other issue, and certainly recently, the U.S. has slanted towards pushing a woke agenda on Africa, where African nations, leaders, and citizens prioritize growth, investment, education, food, and energy security, just dealing with the basics of life. The U.S. and the West, led by the U.S., have really prioritized things like ESG, green energy, whether it's practical or not, the LGBTQ plus agenda, which has really isolated itself. And in particular, this LGBTQ advocacy has been very polarizing in traditional societies, whether they be Islamic, Christian, or African traditional animist. That just doesn't work. And there's been a lot of pushback on both sides. And from an African perspective, they see the U.S. approach as really cultural imperialism, what one is at least called neo-colonialism in drag. And, we started to talk about this, but just to mention it, China has been very, very active in Africa since the 2000s, while certainly the U.S. and largely the West slept as to what they were doing. Their strategy is purely mercantilist. They are exporting goods for Chinese from China, where they can sell their products, where they can put to work excess labor, where that doesn't have a home in China. They are focused on resource extraction, minerals, gas, food. And of course, this is part of a bigger picture of security of empire. They have built one naval base in Djibouti, a military base. They're looking for others on the western coast of Africa. And their investment in Africa over the last 20 years is significantly larger than the U.S. and 10 times greater than Russia's, just to give some perspective there. But they have been much more focused on it with around $43 billion annually, and expected to reach about $90 billion in foreign direct investment by 2035, around $150 billion of debt. Now, it's interesting because in the last few years, some African nations have really begun to push back on the Chinese influence because of this issue of the debt trap. China offered a lot of debt at relatively low rates. A lot of those obligations are now coming due. These nations don't have the ability to repay. It's causing some real consternation and a resetting of this relationship. Nonetheless, it's clear that this remains incredibly important. Now, just at the same time, we just had this BRICS summit in July of 2023 in Johannesburg. Interesting period of time. It led to 6 countries, more had applied, but 6 countries acceded to join BRICS officially beginning in 2024. Argentina, Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Ostensibly, BRICS is an economic cooperation community. It's an agreement to try to open markets, build presence, etc. But underneath all of that is an opposition to the U.S. domination of global financial markets, global financial plumbing, and the weaponization of sanctions. So what this is really focused on is to enable trade and security cooperation and financial cooperation within the BRICS bloc. Now, of course, BRICS started, or at least the name came about from a Goldman Sachs analyst who talked about the name. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the 5 leaders, which you see here assembled in this group, the original 5 country members. Sergei Lavrov here, the foreign minister of Russia, replacing Vladimir Putin, who was concerned about the International Criminal Court and not being able to get out if he got in. But I would note here that if, from a financial markets perspective, the BRICS are doing something interesting, which is forming what they have named the New Development Bank, NDB, as a counter to US-led Western financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. Some of these nations will continue to be members. If they are today, they will continue to be members of the World Bank, of the IMF. But I think they see this clearly as an alternative to shift the power away from these US-led institutions. And it's important to note that this group is clearly dominated by China as the largest and most influential member. Chairman Xi Jinping was there personally in Johannesburg. And so it's interesting that there is some conflict and contention here, because India, Prime Minister Modi, very, very clearly focused on wanting to balance the power with China. South Africa, as I described earlier, careful to not become too indebted or obligated. Russia now basically becoming more and more subject to Chinese influence because of the West's sanctions regime, the U.S.'s sanctions regime. So you've got some co-opetition going on between these nations. And one of the most bizarre is this link up of the fact that both Iran and Saudi Arabia, historical enemies, both culturally, militarily, each competing for domination and influence in the Middle East, have joined. And so we will see how that works out. But again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so in the case of Iran, with the US and Saudi Arabia now pivoting away from the US towards the BRICS, towards China, towards Russia, it makes some sense. So why did they join? And I think there are some countries where, for Argentina, Egypt, and otherwise, this was really about economic issues. Argentina in particular, in some stage, desperation. The economy is in shambles, inflation is running high, looking for a hand up and out from China in particular, and seeing a way to counter the US influence in Latin America, and for themselves to provide a counterbalance to Brazil within South America. Egypt also going through an economic and financial crisis, but pretty strongly opposed to the US-based financial system, which they feel they've been on the short end of the stick. A big partner already with China and India in trade in goods and services, and they have already agreed that they will pay for Chinese, Russian, and Indian imports in those local currencies. Now, Ethiopia has just come out of a civil war. They're trying to reconsolidate under the government. They're a big Chinese partner, but also largely indebted for dams and other infrastructure that hasn't gone as well according to plan or timing. And so there is a dependency here, but certainly they strongly, just like with Saudi Arabia and Iran or Argentina and Brazil, have an interest in counterbalancing the region with Egypt. Ethiopia is the second most populous country on the continent, and certainly an up-and-comer, as is Egypt. Now, Iran strongly opposed to the U.S. system and the sanctions regime. They've been under U.S. sanctions for years. They are keenly interested in deepening the relationship with China and Russia. They are already supplying, they deny weapons, but technology, weapons technology, et cetera, to China. And as I mentioned, they want to counterbalance Saudi interest in the Middle East. And now lastly, we've talked about Saudi Arabia, but lastly, UAE, also regional influence. They've got big trading relationships with China and India. They want to, through Dubai as an international port, look at this as an opportunity to actually branch out and to establish relationships or presence in these other regions around the world, so that they are not just a regional player, so that they have something there in terms of building up their presence. Now, with BRICS, always comes this talk about de-dollarization. Is the dollar now going to go out the window? Are these countries going to introduce their own currency and take over global trading? There was not as much focus, well, a lot of talk about that in anticipation. Not a lot actually happened. I wanted to just, there's been a lot of noise. I've talked about this in the past. I don't want to go into it in detail. I think de-dollarization is a reality. It is a process, but I think it's something that is going to move more slowly than people anticipate. So one indication, something that I found sort of bizarre, is that if you look at, so we've talked in the past about SWIFT. SWIFT is the payments messaging network that all of the US-based links around the world. It's a European-based, but US influenced organization. And this is how the Western financial institutions, the banks, move money around or move information about money around. And when the US sanctions Iran, Russia, or whatever, the step that is taken is to disconnect them from SWIFT so they can't participate in that network. And that's why you've seen China, Russia, and others working on developing alternative messaging and exchange systems in order to move out of this US system. But if you look at this time period, and this was just provided by SWIFT itself, over the 2-year period from about 6 months before, Russia's invasion of Ukraine to today, July 2023, within SWIFT, the US has moved up from 42% to 59% of all transactions. That's a big, big jump, not quite, but almost 20%. How did they do that? Well, it turns out that the euro it has been hit severely. It was nearly 40% 2 years ago of all SWIFT transactions. This excludes payments within the Eurozone because they're stronger, but you see the same directional pattern if you look at the Eurozone payments. Now down to just under 14%. And the US taking all of that share over this period of time. A lot of talk about, is the renminbi going to replace the dollar or the euro or otherwise? It is moving in that direction, but slowly. So they moved up from 1.38 to 2.23% in that 2-year period. And SWIFT was quick to point out that the dollar usage had soared, that this was a record and important. But what they failed to talk about was, okay, well, how much of total global payments is with SWIFT? Because we know the trend that is happening here isn't that countries are moving from the US dollar to other currencies within SWIFT, but actually moving outside of SWIFT itself. Now, the only statistic I've seen so far is that over the year, this year versus last, right now, on a weekly basis, average daily traffic, fin traffic, is down about 2 to 3% against last year. That doesn't say a whole lot. It doesn't sound like the sky is falling, but we don't really know, because what we don't know is how much of these global payments are moving outside of SWIFT altogether, going bilaterally between Russia and China in local currencies, not touching the SWIFT system. We don't know. So I think in order to answer the question, how quickly is de-dollarization happening, we have to understand that. And we need to get better data to do that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Just a few quick takeaways. One, France and thus U.S. influence is under pretty significant threat in West Africa. And if we end up in a situation where France no longer has the role that it's had, the U.S. role is quite weak. And we see Africa divided up between China and Russia and some sort of cooperation agreement between the two neo-colonial powers of the 21st century. The U.S. will be at strategic and economic risk. You can think about critical minerals as being the most obvious example, but our ability to have, for example, today we have CIA military bases in Niger, in many of these countries. Those are at risk and would be at risk, which influences our ability to project power globally. The other issue is this regional stability is at risk of spreading. We'll see whether France actually intervenes or what happens. But this is a significant issue. And then, last point is the BRICS expansion, de-dollarization. These are real issues. They will strengthen the anti-American alliance and weaken U.S. Dollar dominance. But that road is long and winding, and I'm not sure that it's going to happen overnight, the way a lot of the media right now is portending it, and in some ways fear-mongering around it. I think these are real issues, and I am concerned, and I think it portends a lot, certainly for the U.S.'s status as a reserve currency. Recently, I've been talking about something I've called the deficit debt inflation doom loop. If you haven't seen it, you can check it out at stormwall.com. But this idea that with the U.S. continuing to run these massive deficits and issuing more and more debt to do so, it's creating this inflationary spiral, this doom loop from which we're not going to be able to get out. It's like the idea of the point of no return, that we've gone so far, our fuel tanks aren't going to enable us to get back at this point. And this year, it looks like we're going to run nearly a $2 trillion deficit, despite promises through Bidenomics and otherwise that we would get it down to $1 billion or $1 trillion or less. It's going to be $2 trillion this year. And part of that is that because interest rates have risen to above 5%, the U.S.'s debt obligations are now over $1 trillion a year. The service costs on our national debt, which is a number that's larger than defense spending or any other line item in the budget. That is a problem, and that is a doom loop, that we issue more debt to pay interest on debt, and the beat goes on. And so check out that article, check out my other writings on it. I've spoken on a couple of the programs. This has been Stormwall Advisors Monthly Update for September. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do like it, share it, subscribe to my YouTube channel, sign up at stormwall.com to get weekly updates, weekly emails about what I'm writing about, what I'm talking about. I've got a lot to say. Some of it's controversial. Hopefully you'll learn something and enjoy it along the way. Welcome back from summer. Welcome to the fall. And we'll be back with you next month for the next Stormwall Advisors Monthly Update.